This was about 6 months ago. I ended up in the hospital after a bad car accident. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to keep me overnight for observation. A concussion, a fractured wrist, and a lot of bruising. I remember being relieved when they told me I had only need to stay one night. Hospitals have always made me uneasy, even before this. They put me in a private room on one of the older floors. You could tell the difference immediately compared to the newer sections. The lighting was harsher. The walls had that faded, slightly yellowed look, and everything smelled. The nurse who checked me in was friendly enough. She went through the usual questions, adjusted my IV, and told me to call if I needed anything. Visiting hours were already over, so it was just me. I remember asking if the floor was busy, mostly out of curiosity, and she said it was actually pretty quiet that night. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't for some reason. By the time the lights in the hallway dimmed, I was exhausted. The kind of bone-deep tired that comes after adrenaline wears off. I lay there watching the muted TV, listening to the distant sounds of carts rolling and doors opening and closing somewhere down the corridor. It was normal hospital noise, but it echoed strangely, like everything was happening farther away than it actually was. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up abruptly, like I had been shaken awake. My heart was racing, but I didn't know why. The room was darker now, the only light coming from the hallway through the partially open door. That's when I noticed. The call button clipped to my bed rail was on the floor. I was sure it had been secured when I fell asleep. I remember adjusting it so I wouldn't lose it, but now it was just lying there. The cord stretched slightly as if it had been tugged. I stared at it for a moment, trying to piece together how it could have fallen. Maybe I knocked it off in my sleep. That seemed reasonable enough. I reached down carefully, wincing at the pain in my wrist, and picked it up. As soon as I clipped it back into place, the TV turned on. It snapped on at full brightness, the sudden light flooding the room. The screen wasn't showing any channel, just static. I grabbed the remote and turned it off, telling myself it was probably a glitch. Old equipment, old wiring. Hospitals aren't perfect. I tried to go back to sleep. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the door. It creaked open slowly. I assumed it was a nurse checking in, so I turned my head toward the doorway, expecting to see someone step inside. But no one did. The door just stayed there, slightly wider open than before. I waited, expecting footsteps, a voice, something. Nothing came. I called out. There were no answer. I considered hitting the call button, but that felt like overreacting. It was probably someone who had started to come in and then got distracted or realized they had the wrong room. I kept watching the doorway for a while, but eventually I lay back and closed my eyes. That's when the bathroom light turned on. It was behind me, so I didn't see the switch to move. I just saw the glow reflect off the wall in front of me. I hadn't used the bathroom since before I went to sleep. The door had been closed, and the light was definitely off. I turned slowly, every movement feeling heavier than it should. The bathroom door was open now. The light inside was fully on, waiting for someone to step out. Maybe a nurse who had come in quietly while I was asleep. No one came out. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the dull ache in my ribs, and stood up. The floor was cold under my feet, grounding in a way that helped me steady myself. "Is someone there?" I asked, louder this time. Still no answer. I took a few steps toward the bathroom. When I reached the doorway, I leaned in and looked inside. It was empty. The sink was dry. The mirror reflected the harsh light. There was no sign that anyone had been in there. I stepped back, my stomach tightening with a kind of unease I couldn't shake. As I turned away, something slammed. I flinched hard, instinctively raising my good arm. The door to my room had shut completely, like it had slammed. I stood there for a second. The hallway beyond the door was silent again, like nothing had happened. That was the moment the unease turned into something sharper. I walked back to the bed, trying to keep my movements controlled. I told myself I was overthinking it. Doors close, lights malfunctioning, TVs glitch. It all had explanations. I climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket up, even though I wasn't cold. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps inside the room. I sat up immediately. There was no one there. Then the IV pole beside my bed rattled. It shook sharply, the metal clinking as if someone had grabbed it and let go, nearly pulling the IV out of my arm. The call button slipped from the rail again. This time, I watched it happen. It didn't fall. It was pulled. The cord went taut for a split second, and the button dropped to the floor. That was enough. I reached for the button, pressed it, and waited. The footsteps started again, circling the bed. Then the mattress dipped, right beside my legs, like someone had just sat down. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the headboard. The indentation deepened slightly, as if whatever was there adjusted its position. I couldn't see anything, but the bed wasn't flat anymore. I didn't look away this time. I couldn't. The door handle rattled suddenly, loud enough to make me jump. Then the door burst open. A nurse stepped in, asking if I had called. The bed snapped back to normal. I tried to explain what had just happened, but hearing it out loud made it sound insane. She checked the equipment, the IV, the monitor, even the bathroom. Everything was normal. She told me it was probably the concussion, maybe a bad dream, and that I should try to rest. I didn't argue. I just nodded. She left the door slightly open when she went. I didn't sleep after that. I kept the lights on, watched the doorway, and waited for morning. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. I managed to move on, but cannot forget that night. I worked the night shift at a small regional hospital just outside a quiet town in the north of England. The corridors stayed quiet, the lights hummed softly, and the hours stretched in a predictable rhythm of minor injuries and routine care. I had grown used to that stillness. It made everything manageable. It was just after 2:30 o'clock at night when the automatic doors opened and let in a wave of cold air that didn't seem to belong indoor. The man who entered carried that cold with him. He moved slowly, without urgency, and took a seat as if he had all the time in the world. Nothing about him suggested distress, yet something about his presence felt misplaced. When I examined him, there was nothing immediately wrong. His appearance was ordinary, though his clothing seemed slightly out of date, as if chosen from another time. His skin lacked warmth, not pale in a medical sense, but absent of vitality. The most unsettling detail was his eyes, which failed to catch the light in a natural way. They appeared dull, almost flat, as though they reflected nothing at all. The assessment showed no abnormalities. His vital signs were not just normal, but unusually perfect. Every reading fell exactly within range, as though measured against an ideal rather than a living body. Blood tests returned with the same sterile precision. The data existed, yet it felt hollow, as if something essential was missing behind the numbers, with no clear diagnosis. I discharged him before dawn and thought little more of it. 3 nights later, at the same time, he returned. The pattern repeated with unsettling accuracy, and the same entrance, the same measured steps, the same expression that never shifted. I carried out the same procedures, expecting to uncover something I had missed before. Again, the results were flawless. It was during the second examination that I noticed the absence. When I listened for his heartbeat, there was nothing, no rhythm, no faint pulse beneath the silence. I adjusted my position, checked the equipment, and tried again. Still nothing. Yet everything else about him functioned as expected. His breathing appeared steady, though even that seemed slightly unnatural and controlled. I finished the assessment with a growing sense that I was not dealing with something I could explain. He left as quietly as he had arrived. The third visit came without surprise, but with a kind of dread that settled in long before the doors opened. I was already alert when he appeared. The air seemed to shift again, colder than it should have been. I led him into a private room, determined to understand what I had missed. This time, the details became impossible to ignore. When I examined his chest more closely, the movement beneath his skin did not follow the natural irregularity of human breathing. It was too precise, repeating in exact intervals. When I placed my hand against him, the cold was immediate and unnatural, like touching something that had never held warmth. Then, without warning, there was a single heartbeat. At that exact moment, the lights failed. The room dropped into complete darkness, cutting off every machine and every sound that usually filled the space. The silence was overwhelming. For a few seconds, I could not move. When I finally managed to turn on my phone's light, the room was empty. The bed showed no sign of movement. The door remained closed. There was no possible way for him to have left unnoticed. Later, the security footage confirmed what I already feared. He had entered the room, but there was no record of him ever leaving. After that night, I stopped working the late shift. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything that could explain what I had experienced without forcing me to accept it. For a while, the distance helped, the memory dulled, becoming something I could almost dismiss, until the pattern followed me home. It began in a subtle way. I started waking midnight, without knowing why. A lingering chill in rooms that should have been warm. The sense of being observed, not constantly, but just enough to make silence feel unnatural. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing more than the mind reacting to fatigue. Then, one night, I noticed something that removed all doubt. My medical bag sat on the chair across the room, exactly where I had left it. One of the instruments inside had shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. I knew I had not touched it. I was certain of that. The room was locked. No one else had access. A slow, heavy sound broke the silence. A single heartbeat. It did not come from me. It came from somewhere else in the room. I stood completely still, listening as the silence stretched again. The absence that followed felt identical to what I had experienced in the hospital, as if that same impossible presence had found its way back to me. I never saw him again. After that, I become so paranoid that I feel the same unnatural, cold return or a heartbeat that's not mine. I was working nights as a staff nurse on a surgical floor, the kind that gets a mix of patients and overflow cases when other units are full. It was a rainy night. We were short-staffed, which wasn't unusual. One of the older nurses mentioned that a maintenance crew had been working earlier in the evening near the unused fourth floor. That floor had been shut down after some structural issues were found, and although repairs were supposedly planned, nothing had happened for months. It wasn't something I thought about at the time. Abandoned spaces in hospitals are more common than people realize. Around 2:10 o'clock, I was restocking supplies when I noticed something odd on the internal paging screen. A request had been logged from the fourth floor. Not a call light, but a service request, the kind usually sent by staff needing assistance. The name field was blank, and the room number was listed as 402. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to make sense of it. That system required badge access to log anything. Someone would have had to physically be up there. I asked the charge nurse if anyone had gone to the fourth floor. She frowned and said no, then added that maintenance had left hours ago. We both looked at the screen again. The request was still there, she said. It'd probably be a glitch, though her tone didn't sound entirely convinced. I should have let it go. I know that now. But there's a certain mindset you develop in this job where unresolved things bother you. If something's off, you check it. I told her I'd go take a quick look. The stairwell to the fourth floor wasn't locked, just marked with a sign that said, "Authorized access only." I pushed through the heavy door and started up the last flight. The sound of my shoes echoed sharply against the concrete, louder than usual, probably because everything else was so quiet. When I reached the top, the door to the fourth floor was already slightly open. That stopped me for a second. I was sure it should have been closed. Not locked, necessarily, but closed. I pushed it open slowly. The air on that floor felt different, much cooler than other floors. The lights were on, but dimmer than the ones downstairs, like they hadn't been fully powered in a while. The hallway stretched out in both directions, empty and lined with closed doors. There was a smell, too, not strong, but noticeable, something like old fabric or damp drywall. Room 402 was down the left corridor. I started walking, keeping a steady pace, trying not to let my imagination get ahead of me. It was just a building, just a floor that hadn't been used in a while. Halfway down the hall, one of the overhead lights flickered, then another. It wasn't a full blackout, just brief. Something about the way the light moved made it feel like the hallway wasn't as empty as it looked. When I reached room 402, I saw that the door was open. Inside, the room was mostly stripped. The bed frame was still there, but the mattress was gone. A few pieces of equipment sat covered in plastic sheets, the kind that crinkle if you brush against them. The window at the far end showed streaks of rain sliding down the glass. I stepped inside, glancing around for any sign of someone who might have triggered the request. There was nothing. No indication anyone had been there recently. I pulled out my phone to double-check the request details, which were still active, showing room 402. As I looked up from the screen, something moved in the reflection of the window. I turned around quickly. Nothing was there, just the covered equipment and the empty bed frame. I stood there, trying to slow my breathing. I wanted to escape as soon as possible, so I took a step toward the door. It slammed shut right in front of me. The sound was explosive in the small space, making me flinch so hard I dropped my phone. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, the screen lighting up as it slid slightly across the tile. I stared at the door, my heart pounding. I bent down to pick up my phone. As I reached for it, the plastic covering on one of the machines moved, like something underneath it had just adjusted. I froze, my hand hovering inches above the floor. The plastic moved again, this time pulling slightly to one side. There was nothing under it that should have been able to move. I grabbed my phone and stood up quickly. Backing toward the door, the handle didn't turn. I tried again and again. Behind me, something hit the wall. I turned around to look, and one of the IV stands, which had been leaning against the wall, was now on the floor. Before I could react, something else slid across the floor. A metal tray, scraping slowly toward me from the far side of the room. I stumbled back into the door, my shoulder hitting it hard. The handle suddenly gave. The door swung open. I didn't wait. I rushed out into the hallway, my pulse racing, my thoughts scrambling to catch up with what had just happened. I started walking faster, then faster still, until I was nearly running. The stairwell door came into view, and I pushed through it, not stopping until I was halfway down the stairs. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. When I got back to the nurse's station, the charge nurse looked at me immediately. "You were gone a while," she said. I tried to explain, but even as I spoke, she checked the system again. The request from room 402 was gone. No log and no record it had ever been there.